Hi, welcome to MiTek's virtual training for automation equipment. If you find this session helpful, please encourage your colleagues to watch the recording and to attend future live events. The best way for anyone to find out about free training like this is by subscribing to our newsletter. The newsletter also includes user tips, software updates, retrofits, and much more. A recording of the training about to take place, plus many other operating and maintenance videos, can be viewed on our YouTube channel. This recording will be posted by the next day, so please forward it to anyone who might benefit. While you're on YouTube, go ahead and browse our automation playlists to see what other videos can help your team become more efficient. Subscribe to the channel today and turn on notifications to be notified when we post new content. We also have a website where you can locate the part numbers you need to order using our easy-to-use interactive parts guides. There are also equipment manuals and service bulletins there, troubleshooting and safety information, an overview of our in-house training, as well as anything you want to know about new equipment. Okay, about today's training. During this session, use the Q&A window to ask questions as they come up, and we'll answer them in that same window as quickly as possible. You can find these helpful links in the Q&A window also. Now, let's get started with this week's virtual training.
Welcome to Virtual Friday. I'm Bert Beaver, and today we'll be comparing and contrasting component saws with linear saws. And before I introduce our guest speaker, our guest expert, I'd like to briefly give you an overview of his history with MiTek. This gentleman started with MiTek 30 years ago, November 1992. And at that time, he came on as a regional tech rep. Then along about 1995, June of 1995, he became quality assurance coordinator. In July of 1996, he became the help desk coordinator. And in February of 1999, he was the director of technical support. In March of 2002, he became director of software product management. And then in June 2008, he became a district sales manager. And in July of 2020, through the present, he is a regional sales manager. And when I mention his name, I'm sure a whole lot of you are going to immediately know who I'm talking about. And I'd like to welcome Gunnar Isaacson. Wow, what a resume.
That's a long time with MiTek.
It is a long time with any company. Yeah. Something kind of rare these days, actually.
I think so. It's fun to hear that again. And my time in tech support are some tremendously fond memories for me. And
I'm sure
it's been a good run. And the last 15 years, basically in sales, has also been a tremendous amount of fun working with customers here in the Northeast.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I guess the first thing we want to find out is how do you define a linear versus a component saw?
Okay, it's a good place to start. So most people listening today are going to be fully versed in component saws and linear saws, but it's probably a good idea to do a kind of a brief history lesson, and it's a good jumping off point to comparing the two. So initially in the truss industry, there were no specialized saws for cutting truss pieces. So whatever saw you had, and most often it was a bench saw, a pole saw of some kind was used. But as trusses started to be put together on steel gantries and people got quicker about building trusses, we needed a solution that would allow us to cut a larger number of pieces than an army of people could do with pull saws. So component saws were invented. A component saw would be defined as a multiple blade saw that feeds raw material, dimensional lumber, into one end, and through passing through a conveyor to the other side, cuts a high volume of pieces in a short period of time. So that's a component saw. A linear saw is a saw that feeds one stick at a time, usually into a saw chamber. One blade is involved. It applies one or more cuts to a single end of a piece. Something pushes the lumber through the saw, and cuts are made on the back end, and again it's pushed through. So as opposed to kind of a high volume saw that is designed to use a carriage and conveyor system to pass perhaps dozens of pieces in a minute through it, a linear saw is handling only a single piece at a time, and only involves one saw blade, as opposed to a component saw, which operates with either 4, 5, or 6 blades.
So it sounds as if you're cutting one house at a time, you might be leaning towards using a linear saw. Is that accurate?
Well, that's one way to think about it. What saws we currently have right now are usually based on the history. And so if we go back, say, 20 years ago, the only thing that was available was component saws. So component saws were thought of to be the evolutionary step beyond pull saws. And for years and years, there were no linear saws. And then linear saws were developed and entered into the scene, and they had a completely different way of approaching the problem. Again, one stick at a time, one cut at a time. And it was a while before the industry, it intuitively understood that on situations where we only had one of these and one of these and one of these, it seemed to operate quicker. But all of the existing truss manufacturers had component saws, and it was all that they had ever known. So for an entire generation, if you will, in the truss industry, component saws were all that anybody had. And the battle about which component saw should I get had to do with certain things about whether they were well constructed and whether they got out of angulation too quickly. And the big breakthrough with component saws had to do with the fact that setup times were incredibly slow, sometimes 10 or 15 minutes to change over from one cut to another. And with the advent of adding computers and computer setups to those component saws, the time sped up from being, say, 10 minutes changeover to something like 30 seconds to change over. So component saws first with manual setup, then component saws with computerization, which took setup time as it changed over from different piece type to different piece type, went from, say, 10 minutes down to 30 seconds. And then linear saws appeared, and people began to use them. But it was a while before people started to warm up to them and decide, where do they fit? How should I add it to my component saw, or should it be instead of my component saw? And that's some of what we're going to talk about today, is what's been the thinking as linear saws came onto the scene, and what have we learned, say, in the last roughly 20 years since they've come on to the truss cutting scene, about what goes into the decision-making process about which one we should be using, or should we always use both?
Okay. So I guess the logical next question is, what are the benefits of each?
Component saws excel at cutting a large number of pieces that are all the same. So if you had a long rectangular building with common trusses, and this is not unusual in, say, an agricultural building or a very simple single family home, it might just have gable ends on the end of the building and the same truss throughout the entire length of the structure. So if we had 50 identical pieces, or excuse me, 50 identical trusses, and all the pieces in all those trusses were identical, then a component saw would absolutely just knock out that type of a job incredibly quickly and efficiently. So that's where component saws excel. Where linear saws excel has to do with where there are a bunch of different piece types. And I'll introduce a term that will exercise a little bit more later, which is pieces per setup. So a big long a big long run of trusses that are all the same has a very high number of pieces per setup. We might set up the saw and then run 100 pieces that are identical right on through the saw as quickly as we could. That's a high number of pieces per setup. If we have a set of trusses that are no two are the same, all the pieces within the truss are different. Now we might be down to 1 to 2 pieces per setup. In other words, we got to cut one piece, change the setup on the saw. Cut another piece, change the setup on the saw. Those are the low pieces per setup thing. So we know that with linear saws, they do that faster.
You've kind of covered it already, but are there any more specific limitations of each that you think need to be detailed?
There are a few other things that can be said about linear saws versus component saws. I'll name a few of them. They both do. I think we start out with they do cut the same set of lumber. They both cut 2x3s up to 2x12s. So it's the same kind of raw material. They neither one does better than the other in terms of the raw material used in most truss jobs. Linear saws also have the ability to take a whole list of pieces that you may do in a particular job and through a computer program do a thing called optimization, which is to figure out how in, say, a series of, let's say we have 10-foot boards and 14-foot boards. It might look at all the small pieces, all the webs that are going to go into the truss, and it's going to figure out ahead of time a very efficient way to line up those pieces so that we can, say, cut them out of 10s and 14 footers and then have an absolute minimum amount of waste. So that optimization process where we can throw a whole batch of pieces that haven't been cut yet at a computer program, have it figure out an efficient way in order to line up those pieces to minimize waste, and then have the saw cut those pieces in that exact order. This optimization routine was one of the very initial selling points of linear saws, that you could potentially take your waste down to nothing. Because on component saws, you can take a longer piece and cut a shorter piece out of it, but you have this awkward fall off piece now that might be 2 feet long, 3 feet long, 4 feet long. And you just have to kind of set it aside and then cut it manually later. The linear saw with the optimization software eliminates that and minimizes waste. The other thing about linear saws is the ability to mark pieces individually with a lot of additional information directly on each piece. Say, what's the job number, what's the truss ID, what's the piece ID, and even other information about, say, in which end of this board is pointing toward the peak. There's a whole lot of information that can be added to each individual board on a linear saw. There is some marking capabilities on component saws. They just don't have the ability to put as much detail as a linear saw would. The one other thing that has made linear saws attractive to some customers is safety. And that is when we have one blade that is self-contained within a box, basically. There's very little chance that of interacting with that blade, and even a piece that kind of gets caught in the blade and gets thrown outward is likely to just bounce around on the inside of the box. Component saws with the 4, 5, and 6 blades, they usually have some safety fencing around them, but there's still the ability for somebody to reach in there to maybe try to get something loose or grab at something. That's very dangerous. And then there's also the ability for it to just send a stray piece of wood flying out and kind of across the plant floor. And basically the self-contained box that the linear saw is housed in prevents that from happening. So those are a few differences between the linear and the component saw.
Yeah, sounds like as far as safety goes, linear pretty much covers all the bases.
It does. That basic problem about, which one should I buy? We've talked in general about the fact that low pieces per setup, linear saw shines. High pieces per setup, the component saw shines. But I've got a graph and a spreadsheet that I'd like to show that really helps to underline this point and answer that basic question in more detail about which one should I get. So this was a little spreadsheet that I put together after a few years of doing a little head scratching about at what point should a customer consider a linear saw versus a component saw. We kind of understood that one did better at this, but it was a little difficult to put any more detail into it than that. So this was a little thought experiment spreadsheet that I think has been very useful in helping to understand exactly where that point might exist. So all I've done here is basically put in some plausible numbers here for the Cyber AT, which is a component saw, and the MiTek blade saw, which is a linear saw. And on line 3, we see that a Cyber AT, I estimate, takes about 30 seconds between setups, whereas the blade saw really has no transition period. There is no separate setup time. It simply goes to the next piece and the next cut when it's done with the last one. The runtime, meaning how much time does the saw spend on any individual piece, I estimate with the Cyber as being 2 seconds, and with the blade saw at being around 10 seconds. And then the third variable is the average number of people that are working on a particular saw. The Cyber AT has a sawyer, a catcher, and say a half a person as a picker. The blade saw combines both the sawyer and catcher into one position. And then if we add the half a person as a picker, we basically are dealing with a lower cost per hour to simply operate it from a labor standpoint. Then what I did was, using just basically these simple setup and run factors, I took and I asked the question, well, what's the cost per piece going to be if we're cutting 500, if we're cutting 25, if we're cutting 6 pieces, if we're cutting 3 pieces, and so forth. And so now if we switch over to the chart, we can see what those numbers basically result in visually. So the blue line is the Cyber AT, and we can see that when we have high numbers of pieces per setup, our cost per piece of cutting those pieces is very low, much lower than the green line, which represents the blade saw, or the yellow line, which is a blade saw with an automatic feed system like the Ranger system. So as we go forward, as we see that the number of pieces per setup goes down, and most of the customers that I work with in the Northeast average something around 4.5, maybe up to 5 pieces per setup, we can see that the linear saw has passed and now operates at a lower cost per piece as a component saw. So when you look at this, it really makes a compelling case that for most of us and most of the work that we're doing, the linear saw is going to be able to cut the work at a lower cost per piece than the component saw is. And if you are adding, let's say you already have a component saw, you're thinking of adding a second saw, and you add the linear saw, you can send the work, the jobs that are particularly high, or excuse me, low pieces per setup, in other words, the chopped up work, you can send those to the linear saw. You can take any long run jobs you've got, in other words, high pieces per setup, and you can send those to the component saw. So you're kind of having your component saw now specializing in the work that it's good at, and you can have the linear saw specialize in the work that it's good at. So this has been the two main thrusts of the last, say, 10 or 15 years, is customers mostly buying more linear saws than component saws, typically adding them to a shop that already has a component saw, not completely getting rid of the component saw, but just now sending the component saw the work that's the high number of pieces per setup work, and then sending the other stuff to the linear saw. There are a few more progressive companies or startup companies that have simply made the decision that for all the factors we talked about earlier, the linear saw is the only saw in their shop. So even though in theory they'd love to have a component saw when they do certain types of jobs that have long runs, they've just made the decision that with the fact that it's lower cost per piece on the chopped up jobs, it's got the safety issues I mentioned, it's got the ability to mark on pieces, and it's got that ability to do the optimization and therefore reduce waste. All those things have meant that there's plants that have started up that have absolutely nothing but linear saws in them now.
So, yeah, that's a good point. Let's say we have a startup that's they're just now coming up to speed, getting everything running, and it's time, well, almost getting everything running, but they're thinking about what kind of saw they should start off with. So it sounds like maybe the linear saw is probably a good strong consideration in that regard. I mean, it's got the safety issues pretty much covered. It's just the cost in general of operating the saw in many cases sounds like that would be a good choice to start with.
Right. We've talked about, many factors that beyond just this cost per piece that we're looking at in the graph that make a good case for the linear saw. So even though I and a lot of the industry vets, grew up with component saws and we're certainly familiar with them, and we're familiar with different batching routines that try to get the most out of those saws. The more time I've spent with linear saws and studied their advantages, the more I think that they do make a compelling case. But ultimately, customers make their own decisions, and many customers are still very comfortable with component saws, how they work, how they have organized their saw shops for a long time. So it still comes down to a customer decision. But again, having talked with customers quite a bit in the last 15 years, specifically about this question, I think the not just the graph, so to speak, and the fact that most of our work is chopped up and we can apparently do that at a lower cost, It's also, remember, we were looking at the graph and we saw that it was 2.5 people to run a component saw, 1.5 persons, or 1.1 if you have a ranger. Just having one less person that needs to show up for work in order for us to be fully efficient is, another little tick mark in the favor of linear trusses for me. So what I like to do is present the information that I've got and that I've learned and what other people have shared with me with customers that are making the decision. And it ultimately is whatever, you're the one making the decision, you're the one spending the money. My job is just to bring as much evidence and good information that I can to you in order that you can make the correct decision for your business.
Very good. So what resources does MiTek have to help customers determine the best type of saw beyond what we've talked about here?
Well, yeah, new component saws or linear saws are going to be an absolute, cornerstone to any significantly sized operation. So one of the things that we can do is we can look at sample jobs that you will be doing, or that, for example, if you're considering a startup, then you already know the type of work that you're going to be doing. We can do an analysis of those type of jobs in order to see what your number of average pieces per setup is, so that you could, perhaps make sure that the type of work you're doing is well suited to the saw that you're considering. And once that decision is made, we of course help you configure that saw, configure the MiTek software in order to transfer the data directly from design to these saws as efficiently as possible.
Awesome. Well, I think that about covers what we had today. Really appreciate your time, Gunnar, and your knowledge. I think we can all do ourselves a good turn by taking advantage of it. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to do this again with you sometime.
All right, Bert, it was my pleasure. Thank you.